Hello and welcome to Connected With Latham, where we discuss the latest ideas, legal developments and business trends shaping the global economy. I'm Huw Thomas, co-chair of our London corporate department, and in this episode I'm going to be looking at the issue of cyberattacks. We live in a time when technology advances mean that we are all generating and consuming more content than ever before, and that's creating opportunities for a new breed of cyber criminal. Probably most of us have been the victim of some form of cyber attack, and certainly we're all used to reading about big firms, including a number of law firms that have been targeted. To help me get to the bottom of the issue, I have with me my colleague James Lloyd. James is a fellow partner in our London office who specialises in cybersecurity and data privacy issues and regularly advises Latham clients that have been the subject of a cyber attack or data breach, or who are looking to implement resiliency measures to mitigate against that risk. James, welcome to the podcast. Delighted to have you with us.
Thanks, Huw. Good to be here.
Great. To kick us off, James, why don't we talk about the targets? Can you tell us a little bit about the types of companies that are being targeted and why? And are there any themes that we can discern?
The issue with trying to be too specific is that many of these groups tend to specialize in certain sectors. So you might have a particular group that quite enjoys healthcare, for example, or another particular group who goes after technology companies. What drives all of them, however, is money. So the fact that particularly with PE, you have deep pockets, typically there's an appreciation of trying to manage the risk. And so inevitably much of the portfolio will be covered by insurance. Quite often as well, you're dealing with large volumes of data. All of those make them quite attractive targets for attackers. And part of it is, frankly, dumb luck as well. I mean, we can't sort of forget that element. These are businesses, they spread in the sense of fairly nefarious businesses, but they're looking to spread a net very wide to see ultimately what they can grab. Some of them don't really target at all.
But this is pretty mind-blowing. So you're saying that these cyber criminals they're specialists. They focus on a particular industry, particular sector, and they might even have an appreciation for which companies are more likely to have cyber insurance or not.
Yeah, very much so. And I think we'll come on to it to some extent. But, if you're unlucky enough to fall victim to an attack, you can expect these folks to have gone through your accounts. They will look for an insurance policy. They'll figure out roughly where your weak spots are, where your crown jewels in data terms are, where your regulatory pinch points are likely to be. It's deeply sophisticated. I think there's, unfortunately for too many businesses still, there's the view of, look, this is a teenager in a hoodie, hacking into the Pentagon. Classic old view.
That was very much my perception, but how wrong could you be?
Yeah, which makes for great movies during my childhood, but it's no longer the case. Unfortunately, it's very sophisticated, and it really does operate like a business. Right down to the fact that ultimately, if you are paying a ransom, these companies want you to trust them. They will give you reassurances about deleting data that they've taken, about not coming after you again. They'll even give you a helpline to help you try and recover from the attack and to tell you where you need to patch your system. So look, long story short, they are deeply sophisticated, and they're certainly sophisticated enough to think, where is the money? And to go after it pretty ruthlessly.
Amazing. And so how does, moving to the attack itself, how does one of these attacks typically play out? How does the client discover that they have an issue? And at what stage do they bring you in?
Yeah, so I can tell you what happened on Friday at about 6:00. So that's a good example, and took up most of my weekend. So this is pretty typical. It was a ransomware situation. So ransomware, for those who don't know, but I'm sure most do, is a form of cyber attack where the attackers will drop a malicious piece of software onto systems that encrypts those systems and stops them from working. And then typically they demand a sum of money, a ransom, for a decryption key, a way to get those systems back. So on Friday at 6:00, I think a few hours before that, the client had realized that certain systems had stopped working A few hours after that, a few more systems had stopped working, and a few hours after that, they were dead in the water. And it wasn't long after that before they contacted me. That doesn't always happen. Sometimes clients will struggle on for days, even weeks in some circumstances. And I probably would say this, but I'm not sure that leads to the best results. But fundamentally, the focus in those early days, so the weekend, the focus was very much operational.
Right.
So if you're dead in the water, you can't service customers. This was a private equity portfolio company. Operationally, you can't do anything. So with Monday around the corner, your focus is very much, what do we need to do to keep the business running, to keep things ticking over? There's a bit of expectation management there. So you need to be able to accept that the first week you're going to be 20% operational, for example. We're just going to be dealing with emails. Another big part of it is reputational. So communications, what are you going to say when you don't know anything? Really, all you know is that things aren't working. And you need to be cautious as well about what you do say. There's always this pressure to say something positive. In fact, if you start saying something positive that isn't true, that can really come back to bite you later, reputational and a regulatory standpoint.
Yes.
So lots going on, but the focus anyway in those first 48, 72 hours is always operational.
And how often is this happening? How often do you get one of those calls?
More often than I'd like, and they're always on Friday evening, which is the classic joke among cyber incident responders. But there are mega breaches, if you like. So maybe I get involved in a couple of those a year. And look, the costs of those run into the millions, and that's before you even start dealing with regulatory action or any follow-on litigation. These smaller breaches, which are more common, may end up costing less than that, but it's still a significant chunk of cash. And again, it's before any regulatory consequences or litigation. So it's hard to answer the question, but I guess if I were to sort of lay bare exactly all the number of attacks, listeners would be pretty shocked as to how frequent it was.
Yeah.
You only have to look, at the papers just to see how frequent they are.
Of course. And so in terms of our response, imagine I'm the GC of a payment processor client and I realize that my company has been the victim of a cyber attack. I pick up the phone to you on a Friday evening, of course, without giving away all of our trade secrets. What are the next steps? What would you typically advise one of our clients in those kind of first moments?
Yeah, there's a pretty well-established playbook. And so assuming that the incident has actually affected the client directly, and this isn't what we call a supply chain attack, so where there's a third party that the client uses, a supplier perhaps, that's been impacted, the response tends to be pretty similar. What you're trying to do in those first 24 hours is get a handle on what has happened. So you're looking to get involved specialists. So legal, yes, for sure, but a big aspect of it as well is the forensics. So you need to understand, of the systems that I have, is anything still working? Do I have backups working? Have they been destroyed by the threat actor, which is very common on its way out and was the case here in the incident I dealt with at the weekend? And likewise, you start thinking about, well, what is it fundamentally we need to be able to do to continue doing business? But then beyond that, and I never tend to do this in the first 48 hours, but you start to think, so this is sort of during the first week, you're starting to think more about what is the impact in terms of data, in terms of what the attacker might have done in your systems when they were snooping around, because they're not just after insurance information. They're not just looking at your accounts. They're looking to cause maximum damage. And the way that they normally do this is something called double extortion, although I think we're now up to about quintuple extortion, and I'll describe that more in a bit.
Sounds nasty.
Yeah. But fundamentally, aside from the fact that they've dropped this malware bomb on your system that's stopping everything from working, they're now exfiltrating data. And the reason why they do that, and what they'll do is they'll look specifically for personal data, is because they know it comes with a whole bunch of regulatory requirements. So many people will be familiar with the GDPR, but similar legislation the world over. And in circumstances where that data has made its way out of your systems, potentially in dribs and drabs, so as to cover up the trail, you very may likely end up having to disclose that to regulators, privacy regulators. And as we all know, potential fines from those particular regulators can be swinging.
You mentioned double extortion, triple extortion, the double or the kind of triple element, the secondary or the tertiary element is what the fact that as a result of their actions, the target may be exposed to regulatory fines.
Exactly. What the attackers are looking to do is raise pressure. So the first way they do that is to stop your business from working. The second way they do that is to expose you to regulatory pressure. I've seen that only in the past week, I think, has really come to a head. So in the US, where the SEC has just instituted some new rules related to cyber, where companies are expected to disclose attacks within 4 days of their happening, one threat actor group has actually gone ahead and filed a complaint with the SEC. So this is the bad guys who have hacked a company and have made a complaint with the SEC saying they haven't told you about this attack within the time limit. So they haven't complied with the rules, which is just extraordinary. But again, it's a way of bringing regulatory pressure to bear because perhaps attackers are now thinking, well, if you're not going to tell them, I will.
But where is the benefit to the cyber attackers there? Because once they've told the regulator, presumably the company has lost whatever discretion it may have had previously as to whether it would make a report or not. So where does the additional leverage come?
It's a great point. I suspect it's related to behind the scenes in that particular attack. I imagine there was a threat to do it. And then maybe they didn't believe them and they had to go ahead and do it. Because I think you're right. I mean, ultimately, if you're undermining them in that way, maybe it hardens positions and you're less likely to pay a ransom, right? Fundamentally, what drives companies to pay ransoms, and of which there are fewer and fewer, I should say. I think there has been a reluctance in this year, maybe some of last year, to pay. I think it's now down to something like supposedly 60% of victims actually end up paying a ransom. But what fundamentally drives folks is to get their systems back online. Because if they are fully encrypted, you don't have backups, and you're looking at a full system rebuild that might take 6, 9, 12 months, the disruption is enormous. So ultimately, if that's what you're faced with, you probably do pay a ransom.
So ransom is an area that I find completely fascinating. You mentioned that companies are paying ransoms approximately 60% of the time at the moment, which sounds like is a decrease on previous levels, but actually still sounds very high to me. What sort of numbers are we talking about, roughly speaking?
Yeah, it's how long is a piece of string question. It really could be anything. I've seen ransoms in the tens of thousands all the way up to the tens of millions. As we said at the top, fundamentally, if these guys are going into your systems, looking at what you can afford to pay, and they're maximizing their leverage over you, they may just decide, okay, well, great, I'm going to give you a ransom for $50 million or something, or the equivalent in
significant sums.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, look, I mean, that won't be every company. You're talking about massive cyber incidents where they have huge leverage and some companies have deep pockets. But that's not to say that for some companies, even a ransom, of $500,000 or $1 million can't make a significant impact on the bottom line. And particularly not where you're disclosing it, where you're having to justify it to investors and other third parties. It's tricky. Just how do you message that?
Are there specialist negotiators in this area, or is that something that you would do? Would you get involved in negotiating the ransom amount? And how are those negotiations typically conducted?
Yeah, so the way we typically do it, if I've been instructed, it's rare that I would be either conducting negotiations myself or that the client would be doing it. But we tend to use a ransomware intermediary. So these are groups that specialize in dealing with the ransomware actors. They have an enormous amount of intelligence on the groups, in terms of how much ransom they normally demand, whether they're true to their word, so whether they provide the decryptor, whether they delete data, and so on. And so all that can be very helpful intelligence when you're deciding whether or not to actually pay a ransom. But the main goal at that stage is playing for time, because you don't know what has happened to your systems.
Yeah.
More information that you can get really informs the decision as to whether you should pay a ransom. And so the goal is delay.
And those negotiations, are they conducted over the phone? How does it work? Who do you call to negotiate the ransom?
Yeah, well, exactly. So very helpfully in their ransom notes, which normally appear on every system that they've encrypted, there will be details. Sometimes it's a chat on the dark web, so a simple program that allows you to chat with the attackers. Sometimes it'll be an email address, an encrypted address. You don't really gain very much from that. There's some suggestion that if you're using the chat online, it can be, or on the dark web, it can be less helpful to you because the attacker is able to see when you've logged in, when you've looked at the messages and so on, whereas over email is perhaps preferred. But ultimately, you're restricted to whatever options they actually give you. And then typically you'll get a transcript back from whichever intermediary you're dealing with. And then it's a discussion with management, with other investors as to how to deal with it best. Because, oftentimes there's no right answer to this.
Right. And to the uninitiated, it might seem odd that companies are paying ransom money to cyber criminals. We're so used to thinking about money laundering, terrorist financing, proceeds of crime issues. Do any of those issues come into play here? And how does a company that elects to pay the ransom know that they aren't financing terrorism?
Yeah, it's a great question. There are indicators, but what we might see is what we call hands-on keyboard. So getting back to really understanding who's behind the ransom note is next to impossible. Threat intelligence agencies will have a lot of information on where these attackers might be based, and that can give you some good clues. I have had instances where there are suspicions of groups that are linked to terrorism, but again, it can be very difficult to actually tell. In those situations, you can have difficulty in actually finding somebody to make the payment, particularly where you come up against sanctions, of course. So making payments contrary to sanctions is going to land you in some serious trouble. Anybody who's touching that decision or where the money is flowing, be that from a parent company, for example, might get caught up in that transaction. And you're talking about criminal sanctions, so you're potentially talking about going to jail. And that really focuses minds, unsurprisingly. But yeah, so it is what you try to do as much diligence as you can based on the intelligence you have available. And that's where, we have very good colleagues when it comes to sanctions law that, I typically draw on and get some comfort that we're acting within the letter and the spirit of the law, because obviously those are very serious issues.
This is a well-known thing. Does the UK government or do other governments have an official position on ransom payments?
They do, as do many governments. And the official position is you should not pay. But it's not unlawful. There's been no attempt to discourage people from paying, apart from various speeches and various memoranda produced. I mean, ultimately, I think that's a recognition of the fact that practical reality of this is that you have to pay sometimes. You can't spend 6 months rebuilding systems. You need a decryption key in some circumstances. The damage to the business, to the economy would be too great.
Yeah.
It's a problem. And ultimately that drives a lot of the regulation in this area.
And are ransom payments covered by cyber insurance? I think based on your earlier answers, they are, but
they often are. Not always, but typically, yeah, you would expect to be able to recover that under your insurance policy. Certainly 2020, 2021, there was this huge spike in cyber attacks and a subsequent hardening of the insurance market. So a lot of carriers suffered some pretty big losses. You can still get it. Absolutely. It's just that there are a lot more hoops to jump through nowadays, a lot more expectation that you should share information on your systems, on your security tooling, really sort of get down into the weeds to make sure that what you say about your systems is true.
This is presumably in order to take out a cyber insurance policy. This is the insurer
That's right.
doing diligence on the insured when they
That's right.
decide the premium and whether they wish to insure at all.
Exactly right. One of the questions I was interested in your view on, because it's something that I really struggle with, is if you're seeing insurers doing this level of diligence on companies' security postures and the various tooling, is why we're not seeing more of it in deals. Because, I certainly on the flip side of it, I see assurances given during the diligence phase of, look, we have appropriate technical and organizational measures, and that seems to sort of satisfy parties. And I appreciate, of course, you can take out insurance and, hedge against that risk. I guess I'm just surprised, particularly when I look at that statement and I look at what I know about the company, and frankly, it's just not true.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends very much on the target and on the purchaser. I think in very data-heavy industries where the purchaser attributes significant value to the data and to the IT infrastructure, then we often do see bidders spending on fairly involved technical IT and cyber diligence. But I think you're right that in other sectors that are maybe not so data heavy, purchasers often do pretty light touch diligence. in
Yeah.
this area, and it takes some time for folks to adjust to the new reality. And we still see a lot of businesses that don't have cyber insurance, don't see value in cyber insurance.
Yeah, that's the case for the company that suffered the attack over the weekend. Not a particularly data-heavy company by any means, but as I say, operationally is dead in the water. I think data and privacy is one way to look at it, but I do feel that the more sophisticated view nowadays ought to be to look at it from the broader context of cybersecurity, and not just that subset of privacy.
Moving beyond the issue of ransom, what other issues do companies that are the victim of a cyber attack need to think about? We've talked about data breach notifications. I suppose there are data recovery and remediation costs, presumably, but what are the other issues?
Yeah, so once you've contained your breach and hopefully recovered, you're really looking at improving your system. So cybersecurity is very much the phrase that's associated with it is called continuous improvement, because it reflects the fact that no system is ever truly secure. It's an arms race fundamentally. You think about new AI tools and the way in which they're almost certainly leveraged nowadays by attackers and are starting to be leveraged as well on the defensive side. You're constantly having to look for ways to improve your systems. Once you've done that and you've managed to get yourself in that sort of headspace, I think it's all about preparedness. Like, you need to keep preparing for the next attack. Now, ideally, an attack would not be your first practice. It often is, unfortunately. So it's all very well sort of having these great plans, but if you go and put them on a shelf to gather dust, when it comes to it, you're simply not going to know what to do. And, I spend a lot of time with companies just running through what the plans are. They don't need to be extensive exercises by any means, simply just running through who's doing what and when and why. Really important for the understanding. And you tend to iron out a lot of wrinkles before the worst actually happens.
And so what sort of things would that be?
The starting point is always categorizing an incident. So when these things first arise, it's not always possible to sort of say, oh, well, it looks like it's just these one or two computers that are impacted, and suddenly, it's the entire server estate. It's never that clear cut. And it's only once you can come up with a pretty sophisticated way, or at least a consistent way of assigning the priority of those incidents and figuring out when you need to involve legal and when you need to involve comms and when you need to involve management, when this needs to be escalated, that you can really have an effective plan. But it's really just describing who does what in that situation, who's in the incident response team,
Right.
who takes control. And knowing when to escalate is just crucial. This goes beyond just an IT issue, as we've spoken about. It really depends, there's so many legal risks that flow from this, including obviously regulatory, yes, but just follow-on litigation. Litigation with customers and suppliers is something we're seeing more and more of.
Right.
There are obligations in contracts that require disclosure in the event of a security incident, not even linked to this customer's particular data, for example. Inevitably, it's quite a public thing that happens. People will find out about it, either because your website is down, you can't service customers, or because you have to tell them.
And how much of your time is spent advising on prevention versus cure?
Probably not as much as it should, which I think reflects the sort of unwillingness to really grapple with it up front. And to some extent, a lot of our clients are very sophisticated and they will have in place plans and appropriate procedures already. I think, though, just getting a view as to that escalation piece and really making sure that legal is involved to make the calls on the right sorts of incidents early on can really save a lot of hassle. There's always a reluctance to involve legal because you don't want to slow down the process, but fundamentally, the earlier you do it, the better the outcome, frankly.
Right. Are you noticing clients becoming more willing to spend on prevention and to spend the time as well on doing these practice runs?
Yeah, I am. And look, it's great to collaborate with you and the rest of the corporate team at Latham. I think it just reflects a general interest and a growing awareness of cyber risk. And look, there are a stack of tools and a stack of approaches and great advisors all over the place. I think it's getting an advisor like Latham with a combination of you understanding really how PE works and me understanding how cyber works means that you can actually put the right risk threshold in the right place when it comes to your portfolio.
Of course. And are you noticing that cyber insurance is being denied to companies that haven't engaged properly with prevention?
That is certainly the case. I haven't seen it off the top of my head, but it's a requirement that you will have in place certain preparedness steps. So you will run, for example, 2 simulations a year, 2 tabletop exercises, we call them. So where you're actually running through what the plan is, or they'll want to review your incident response plan. So they'll want to make sure that that threat assessment is accurate and is as reflects current market practice. And ultimately, that's a good thing because the insurers are seeing a great many more cases than a lot of the rest of the market. So getting their view means that you're getting some good benchmarking.
Yeah. Going back to ransom for a second, do the insurers get involved in the ransom negotiations if they are footing the bill for those ransom payments?
Typically not. So normally the negotiation itself will be very much for the company. The insurer will be informed and will normally get sign off in advance before payment of any ransom.
Right.
But no, the insurer typically won't be involved. The insurer might want to see information on the due diligence that you've conducted to make sure that it's covering itself from a sanctions and legal risk perspective. But typically it's not at that stage that we see particular issues.
Okay. Bringing it back to cyber attacks as a deal issue and where my fellow corporate colleagues might see these issues, what are the issues that we need to think about in the context of an M&A transaction? We touched briefly on diligence. Is it just a question of actually understanding the resiliency measures that a target has put in place and perhaps encouraging our clients to do the technical IT diligence?
I think that's part of it. I think the other part is during the diligence phase. So not just taking another party's answer as read, which I appreciate is never done, but I think there's just a temptation not to sort of test that, perhaps because its nature is quite technical, right? But fundamentally, what you're trying to understand is, how secure are your systems? Have you dealt with cyber attacks before? And how did they go? Do you have a current cyber attack? I mean, like, you wouldn't believe just how often that comes up, right? Like, I mean, you've seen it. Oh, well, yeah, just all the time. And again, I think it goes back to some of the sophistication of these attackers. I think they see that as a pinch point. They know it's a good time to attack. But asking questions like that really get under the hood of how the organization responds, how it has responded, I think can really help you to get a sense for their approach, the type of tooling that they have, asking about improvements that they made if they have suffered an attack. Did they actually take it seriously? Have they actually invested in the right kind of tooling? All of that can be really instructive.
And do you ever find that sellers or targets are reluctant to share full detail on cybersecurity risk issues?
Yeah, I do. And I get it. Ultimately, you want to keep that security, that detail close to your chest. That's part of what makes it secure. But as ever, it's a bit like intellectual property, I suppose. Like you need to be able to see the value in it. You have to understand part of it. And so while there is a reluctance to share, there must be some kind of compromise made. And I do think one of the best ways to get at it is sort of by talking around that and understanding what they do to prepare for incidents, how they respond to incidents, because that way you're not asking them just outright, well, here you go, tell me all about your firewalls and tell me about your logging and tell me about which endpoint detection and response tools you have. And do you have Sentinel-1 and this, that, and the other, which are all great questions and very valid. And they may be prepared to answer those, but fundamentally, it doesn't really capture, is anybody actually even looking at the output from all of these great tools? What are you doing with them?
Yeah.
Like from an organizational perspective, how well organized are you? Yeah. It's all very well talking about it, but you've got to put it into practice.
It's the usual issue of it's all very well having policies, but are the policies actually followed?
Exactly right.
Which
exactly.
Which you can't discern from just looking at documents in a data room. You need to actually have a dialogue with the right person at the company and figure out whether they know what they're talking about.
Yeah, you've got to test it. And ultimately, cyber risk, it needs to be treated like any other risk. to the company. We've discussed some of the risks and we've discussed some of the potential fallouts, but it can be very expensive and it's happening more and more. So it just surprises me, to the earlier point, that more people don't press when they're faced with those kinds of responses.
How about liability for historic attacks or historic data breaches as a diligence issue? We've touched on the risk of follow-on litigation, of regulatory fines. I think it was implicit in what you were saying earlier about double and tertiary risk that perhaps some companies are taking a view that they might not make a data breach report in circumstances where perhaps they really ought to.
Yeah.
And that's how these cyber attackers are kind of bringing additional leverage and pressure to the situation. So presumably all of that should really be explored as part of diligence if we establish that there has been a cyber attack in the past.
Yeah, I think that illustrates really well to me the difference between privacy and cyber when it comes to diligence issues. So if you were to ask a company that had suffered an attack but had decided not to disclose it to the ICO, for instance, the UK privacy regulator, they might say, and you might ask them a question that says something like, have you made any disclosures to the ICO? And they can justifiably say no in that circumstance, but that's only because they decided that it didn't hit a certain threshold. On the other hand, if you're asking, have you experienced any security incidents in the last 12 months or 24 months? Tell us about those. It's a much broader concept. But to answer your question, yeah, we do see this. So the liability that you're potentially taking on comes in all kinds of forms. If it is an attack like that, where you realize after you've made the acquisition, you've gone in, you've really kicked the tires in terms of the assumptions that were made, or maybe you get a complaint, maybe you get an inquiry from a regulator that really sort of prompts you to dig into it. It's at that point it might make for a pretty unpleasant surprise. So just pricing all of that in up front is critical. It's going to be challenging, but I think there are the right questions that we can ask, or there are certain questions that will get us to the right answers anyway.
James, I feel like I could go on quizzing you on this for hours, but unfortunately we are out of time. Thank you so much for taking the time to discuss with me.
Thanks very much, Huw. Thanks for having me.
And thank you also to all of our listeners. You can subscribe and listen to new and archived episodes of our Connected with Latham podcasts on lw.com, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like more information about the topics in this podcast, please email us from links located in the show description. We hope you'll join us again next time.
This podcast is provided as a service of Latham & Watkins LLP. Listening to this podcast does not create an attorney-client relationship between you and Latham & Watkins LLP, and you should not send confidential information to Latham & Watkins LLP. While we make every effort to assure that the content of this podcast is accurate, comprehensive, and current, we do not warrant or guarantee any of those things. And you may not rely on this podcast as a substitute for legal research and/or consulting a qualified attorney. Listening to this podcast is not a substitute for engaging a lawyer to advise you on your individual needs. Should you require legal advice on the issues covered in this podcast, please consult a qualified attorney. Under New York's Code of Professional Responsibility, portions of this communication contain attorney advertising. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. Results depend upon a variety of factors unique to each representation. Please direct all inquiries regarding the conduct of Latham & Watkins attorneys under the New York's disciplinary rules to Latham & Watkins LLP, 1271 Avenue of the Americas, New York, New York, 10020. Phone number 1-212-906-1200.